The fire in the stove is banked down low, more coal than flame, and outside the wind is screaming against the cabin walls like it wants in. Every window is stuffed with rags. Every gap under every door has a rolled blanket pressed against it. And on top of that stove, a pot of beans has been simmering since before supper, filling the one-room cabin with steam and the smell of salt pork and wood smoke. It is, by every measure a pioneer woman had, a good night. The children are asleep, the fire is holding, the storm outside cannot get in. And that is exactly the problem. Here's the thing that will stop you cold once you understand it. The very act of sealing a cabin up tight against a blizzard, the thing that felt like safety, the thing every frontier wife was taught to do to keep her family from freezing, killed more pioneer women and their children than the blizzards themselves ever did. Not the cold, not the wind, not the snow piling up past the windowsills, the cooking fire. The one she kept alive all night so her family would wake up warm and fed. I know how backward that sounds, so stay with me, because once you see how this actually worked, you'll never look at a banked stove the same way again. Let me tell you where this comes from, so you understand I am not guessing at any of it. This isn't campfire folklore dressed up to sound dramatic. This comes from doctors' case notes, from county newspaper archives, from the diaries and letters pioneer women themselves left behind, describing symptoms in their own words before anyone had a name for what was happening to them. Homestead records from the Dakotas, from the Montana Territory, from the hard prairie winters of Kansas and Nebraska are full of entries that all sound eerily the same. A family found unwell in the morning. A mother and her children found unresponsive. The fire still going. No sign of struggle, no sign of illness the night before, nothing broken, nothing burned. Just a house that had been sealed too well. The wisdom that got handed down to pioneer wives was simple, and it made sense on its face. Seal the cabin, keep the fire fed, and you'll survive the winter. Sealing kept the wind out. The fire kept the family warm and cooked the food that kept them alive through months when nothing grew and nothing could be hunted easily. A cabin that held its heat overnight was a cabin that didn't lose children to frostbite. That much was true, and pioneer women who mastered it were rightly proud of it. A well-banked fire, one that would smolder low and steady from midnight until dawn without anyone needing to wake and feed, it was considered one of the great skills of frontier housekeeping. Some women were known across whole counties for how well they could bank a fire to last the night. Here's where most people go wrong, and this is the whole spine of the story, so lean in close. The thing that made a fire good for banking overnight, the low, smoldering, oxygen-starved burn that could hold through a 10-hour night without going out, is the exact same thing that made it dangerous. A fire that burns hot and clean, with plenty of air, converts almost all of its fuel into heat and harmless smoke. A fire that's been choked down low, damp or closed air starved so it'll last until morning, doesn't burn clean anymore. It burns incomplete. And an incomplete burn doesn't just make less heat. It makes a gas that has no color, no smell, and no warning. What today we call carbon monoxide, and what pioneer families, when they had a name for it at all, called coal gas, damp, or simply bad air. A cabin that's been stuffed with rags against every crack, windows blocked, doors weighted down against the storm, is a cabin with almost no way for that gas to escape. The very same ceiling that kept the cold out was the ceiling that kept the poison in. And a family that had done everything right by the standards of the day banked the fire well, sealed the house tight, kept everyone warm and fed, was without knowing it, running a slow, silent experiment on themselves every single night that the blizzard kept them locked inside. Now here's the part that ought to make you sit up straight, because this is the layer almost nobody today understands about how this actually killed people. It wasn't the men out working the fields or hauling wood who were dying from this. It was disproportionately the women and the children, the ones who stayed closest to the stove the longest, the ones tending the fire, cooking through the day, sitting near that stove through the evening doing mending or reading by its light, and then sleeping in the same single room, sometimes just feet away from it all night long. The pioneer wife who took the greatest pride in her fire management, who kept it burning lowest and longest, who never let it go out on the coldest nights, was statistically in the most danger of anyone in that cabin. Her devotion to the one skill she'd been taught to master was the very thing putting her closest to the source of the poison. That's a cruel irony, and it gets crueler still when you look at how the poisoning actually presented itself. Because this is the second layer almost nobody sees coming. Carbon monoxide poisoning doesn't announce itself. It doesn't burn your throat or make you cough the way smoke does. In its early stages, it feels almost exactly like a head cold or plain exhaustion. A dull headache, a little dizziness, nausea that felt like it might just be something she ate. Drowsiness that, on a long, dark winter night with a warm fire and a full stomach, felt like nothing more than a woman who'd earned a good night's sleep after a long day of work. Doctors who later studied frontier deaths from this cause noted again and again that the victims in the hours before they died likely believed they were simply tired. Many probably lay down thinking they'd feel better in the morning. Some records describe families found still in their beds. No sign of alarm on any of their faces, as if they had simply drifted from sleep into something deeper without ever knowing the difference. Think about what that means. The poison that was killing them felt, in its early hours, exactly like the comfort they were trying to achieve. Warm, sleepy, safe. A pioneer wife lying down next to her children on a howling winter night, feeling the day's exhaustion finally catch up with her, had almost no way of knowing whether that heaviness in her limbs was well-earned rest or the first quiet stage of asphyxiation. The very sensation she'd spent the whole day working toward, warmth, stillness, the deep relief of a hard day done, was the same sensation the gas produced as it built up in her blood. There was no way, in that moment, in that century, for her senses to tell the difference. So layer 3, and this is the part that ties the cooking itself directly into the danger, because this wasn't only about heating the cabin overnight. It was about cooking through the night too. Beans that needed to soak and simmer for hours before they were tender enough to eat come morning. Stews that cooked low and slow because that was the only way to stretch a small amount of meat into a meal for a large family. Bread that needed the residual heat of the stove to rise properly overnight before baking at first light. All of it meant the fire had to be kept alive, low, steady, and banked down tight for the entire night, every single night, all winter long. This wasn't an occasional risk taken on the very coldest nights. It was baked into the daily rhythm of frontier cooking itself. Every single night that a pot needed to simmer until morning was another night the damper stayed mostly closed and the gas had nowhere to go. And this is where the irony completes itself. Because the nights when this happened most were, without fail, the very worst blizzard nights. The nights when sealing the cabin tightest felt most urgent, when every rag was stuffed into every crack because the wind outside was strong enough to kill a person exposed to it in minutes. The worse the storm raged outside, the tighter the family sealed themselves in. And the tighter they sealed themselves in, the more dangerous that low, smoldering all-night cooking fire became. The very storm that felt like the enemy outside was, without anyone realizing it, making the real enemy inside stronger. Pioneer families were, in the truest sense, defending themselves against the wrong threat, all while unknowingly making the real one worse. You're probably wondering by now why nobody warned them. Why this wasn't common knowledge passed down the same way fire starting or food preservation was. And the answer here isn't some hidden conspiracy. It's quieter and sadder than that. Carbon monoxide as a concept, an invisible gas that could kill without warning, wasn't well understood by ordinary people in the 1800s the way we understand it now. Doctors on the frontier, when they were even called to examine a family found dead or gravely ill after a stormy night, often had only vague language for what they'd found. Terms like asphyxiation, bad air, or foul vapors show up again and again in the sparse records that survive without any real explanation of the chemistry behind it. Nobody was hiding this knowledge from pioneer wives. Nobody understood it well enough yet to hide it. The wisdom simply hadn't caught up to the danger, and by the time medical science did understand exactly what carbon monoxide was and how it built up in enclosed spaces, most of these homesteads had already given way to houses with proper chimneys, better-built flues, and eventually electric heat that made the whole danger a thing of the past. The knowledge arrived too late to help the women it would have saved, and by the time it existed, the specific danger it addressed had mostly disappeared along with the cabins themselves. Let me be straight with you here, the way I'd want someone being straight with me. I won't tell you this is something you need to fear tonight. Your home almost certainly isn't sealed with rags stuffed into every gap, and if you've got a wood stove or a furnace, building codes and carbon monoxide detectors exist specifically because this exact danger was eventually understood well enough to design against it. This isn't a warning about your house. It's a window into how differently danger worked in a world where the difference between comfort and death could come down to how tightly a woman sealed her home against a storm, and how well she'd been taught to keep a fire going, without ever once being taught what that fire could quietly do to the air she and her children were breathing. But there is a real lesson buried in this one that outlasts the specific danger of coal gas in a sealed cabin, because pioneer women did eventually learn to protect against this, piece by piece, generation by generation, long before anyone had the scientific language to explain exactly why their methods worked. Some learned, through hard experience and the loss of neighbors or family, to never seal a cabin completely, no matter how fierce the storm outside. A small gap left deliberately, a window cracked even an inch of flue checked and adjusted rather than closed, all the way became part of the unwritten rules some households passed down. Some women learned to recognize the early warning signs in themselves, and their children a headache that didn't fit the day, a heaviness that felt different from ordinary tiredness, and would, on instinct alone, open a door to the freezing night air rather than settle in for sleep. Some communities developed the habit of checking on isolated homesteads after the worst storms, specifically because too many families had been found the same terrible way, still and quiet, with the fire still smoldering in the stove. None of these were solutions anyone could explain with real science at the time. They were the kind of hard-won caution that comes only from loss passed mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, without ever needing a name for the danger they were guarding against. A pioneer wife who insisted on cracking a window even on the coldest night, who checked her children's color and breathing before she herself lay down, who trusted a nagging unease over the comfort of a perfectly sealed house, was practicing a kind of wisdom that had nothing to do with book learning and everything to do with paying close attention to what her instincts were quietly trying to tell her. And that, more than the specific danger of a banked fire in a sealed cabin, might be the real lesson worth carrying forward. Those women didn't die, the ones who died because the winter was simply too cruel for them. The winter was only ever the winter. They died because the very thing they'd been taught to trust completely, the fire that kept them warm, the seal that kept the wind out, was allowed to become so routine, so automatic, so certain, that nobody thought to question whether the comfort it gave might be hiding something underneath it. The families who survived those same blizzards, in those same kinds of cabins, were very often the ones who kept just a sliver of doubt alive, even in the depths of the worst nights. A crack left open. A fire checked rather than simply trusted. A small refusal to seal every last gap, even when sealing every last gap felt like exactly the right thing to do. The cold never killed as many pioneer wives as their own certainty did, the certainty that a warm, sealed, well-tended home could hold nothing dangerous inside it. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment, long after the specific facts about coal gas and green wood and closed dampers have faded from memory. The most dangerous nights weren't always the ones where the storm outside was loudest. Sometimes they were the quiet ones, when everything felt taken care of, when the fire was holding steady and the house was finally perfectly still. So tell me down in the comments, is there a piece of old household wisdom your own grandmother or great-grandmother carried that you never fully understood the reason behind until much later? I want to hear it, because so many of these old habits turn out to have a real reason buried underneath them, one that took generations to fully explain. Next time, I want to walk you through a different kind of frontier mistake, one that has nothing to do with fire or cold at all. It's about the food pioneer women were taught to preserve for winter, a method that felt perfectly safe and was used in nearly every homestead kitchen in America, and how one small mistake in that process quietly killed more pioneer families than any wolf or blizzard ever managed to. Until then, keep that window cracked, even just a little, and never let a warm, quiet house convince you there's nothing left to watch for.